Good evening, and thank you for joining us to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the birth of Canadian composer Oskar Morawetz, which actually occurred on January 17th. My name is Claudia Morawetz, and I'm the daughter of the composer. This evening, I will take you on a multimedia journey through Oskar's life, both as a person and as a musician. My story in pictures, audio, and video will be interwoven with select compositions by Oskar, performed by wonderful musicians here at UBC's School of Music. And so we begin in a tiny village in the Czech Republic, about an hour from Prague, called Světlana Sázava, where my father was born in a castle. This was the summer residence of the Morawetz family, an estate that included 40 acres of parkland, where the children swam and boated in the nearby lake. Oskar's father, Richard, was a businessman and owned a textile factory in the small town of Úpice. During the school year, the family lived in Úpice while the children were still in primary school. And in the summers, Světla was where the family cultivated the close bonds with their immediate and extended family. Oskar's mother, Frida Glaser, was the youngest of 7 children, and so there were many gatherings of uncles and aunts and cousins. This strong sense of family continued into the next generation. And even today, our family keeps in contact with relatives from as far away as England, Austria, the Seychelles Islands, and Brazil. Oskar's immediate family included an older brother, Herbert, who was a studious and serious one, Oskar, who is the big tease, always coming up with practical jokes, a younger brother, John, who admired his big brother and was a willing participant to any scheme that Oskar invented, and a sister, Sonia, who must have been a tough cookie with 3 older brothers and was mercilessly teased by Oskar. Apart from being a prominent businessman, Oskar's father had many hobbies, including public speaking, acting, photography, and making movies. Amazingly, this movie survived the war, and in it we see the earliest film of Oskar at the age of 7. This is a short excerpt from a 20-minute movie made by Richard in honor of his mother-in-law's 60th birthday. The premise of the movie is baking a chocolate cake for the birthday party, and how Oskar and John get at the cake, and older brother Herbert admonishing them for their transgressions. When Oskar was 6, his mother called him to meet a lady who would teach him how to play the piano. Well, Oskar thought it was like a card game. She would show him the trick, and then he would be able to play the piano. And thus began his musical education. He quickly showed talent, and it was discovered that he had perfect pitch. But more than practicing, Oskar loved to sight read any music he could get his hands on. This frustrated his teachers to no end, who wanted their students to perfect 1 or 2 pieces. Oskar read piano reductions of symphonies, operas, and he soon learned to score read, and in this way became familiar with a vast amount of music literature. An anecdote that his brother Herbert recalls, that they were sitting in a restaurant and a radio was playing music in the background. And suddenly Oskar abruptly interrupted Herbert and said, "Shh, I want to listen." And after a few minutes, Herbert said, "Have you heard this music before?" Whereupon Oskar replied, "No, but I read the score some 10 years ago." At the age of 10, the family moved to Prague, and Oskar began piano lessons with Professor Hofmeister, who was the head of the Prague Conservatory, and theory with Professor Krička. Hofmeister assigned challenging pieces, not expecting perfection. Oskar learned extensive amount of music, and this suited him very nicely. At the age of 16, Oskar gave his first piano recital in his hometown of Světla. His familiarity with the piano meant that he wrote almost 20 works for the keyboard. And as he originally wanted to be a pianist, we're going to begin this musical part of the program with one of these piano compositions. The Fantasy in D minor was composed in 1948 and later recorded by Glenn Gould. Oskar met Glenn shortly after moving to Canada. In Glenn, he found a soulmate with whom he could discuss any musical topic. They were musical nerds. Before the recording, Oskar asked if he could listen to Glenn play the piece. Glenn repeatedly refused. And as the recording date approached, Oskar pleaded. And finally, Glenn relented on one condition. He said, "You say nothing." So Oskar listened silently with increasing unease. The tempos, the dynamics, accents, he hardly recognized the piece. And when he was finished, Glenn said, "So, what do you think?" So Oskar mentioned a few things, whereupon Glenn impatiently declared, "The trouble with you, Oskar, is that you don't understand your own music." With this, I'd like to welcome Mark Anderson to play the Fantasy in D minor. I mentioned that Oskar wanted to be a pianist, but as we know, he made a career as a composer. So what happened? Well, in fact, his destiny was far from being a musician at all. Following tradition in Europe at that time, as the firstborn, Oskar's brother Herbert was to take over the family business. And as Oskar was second in line, he was expected to pursue a career as a forester, managing the estate at Svetla. Well, out of respect for and devotion to his father, and because he had unbounded faith in his judgment, he accepted this decision and actually studied forestry for 2 years. But his father saw that Oskar's heart was in music, and he decided to let him study music for a while. This was pre-World War II, and anti-Semitism was on the rise in Czechoslovakia. And as the Morawetz family was Jewish, it was decided that he should go to Vienna to study music. Well, Oskar was 20 years old. He was studying piano in the center of a musical culture, living in a dream world. He attended concerts and operas. He heard Bruno Walter, Wilhelm Furtwängler. But in March of 1938, Nazi Germany entered Austria. And one day, after a music lesson, Oskar stopped in front of a store and read a sign that it was affixed to the storefront. And the sign said, "Entrance forbidden to dogs and Jews." And as he was reading the sign, suddenly a Gestapo man grabbed him by the collar and started to question him. He was so shaken by the incident that the next day he fled home. In December of 1938, his father sent him to Paris. He studied on his own without a teacher, benefiting from the cultural environment. And in March of 1939, Hitler invaded Czechoslovakia. His parents fled to England and applied to go to Canada. They asked Oskar if he'd like to join them. Canada? All Oskar had seen of Canada was a vast, barren land. It seemed like a wilderness, and he couldn't imagine there was any musical culture there, so he declined. But soon war was imminent, and regretted his decision. In August of 1939, his parents set sail from England, stopping in Cherbourg. Oskar traveled all night to Cherbourg to say a tearful goodbye. He thought he might never see his parents again. War broke out in September of 1939, and suddenly the Czechs were considered enemy aliens of the French. And now he had great difficulties. The Czechs were not allowed to take money from a bank. The Czechs were not allowed to travel beyond 10 kilometers. And Oskar was frightened that if he was stopped by the police, he would be handed over to the Nazis. His plan was to go to Portugal, because they were still accepting refugees, but he could not get a transit visa through Spain. In October 1939, he got a 2-week transit visa to Italy, but by the time he arrived, Portugal was no longer accepting refugees. And now his situation was really tenuous. Italy was an ally of Hitler. He survived under the patronage of a business associate of his father, and he continued to apply for visas, and he was continually refused. The businessman's daughter took a liking to Oskar, and she accompanied him to the visa office one day. And once again, his visa was refused. The daughter coyly looked at the officer and said, "Don't you know who I am?" At which point the visa was granted. And then in March of 1940, Oskar flew to the Canary Islands, and then on to Santo Domingo. Why not Canada? Well, because Canada had an anti-Semitic director of immigration, Mr. Blair, who was determined to keep Oskar out of Canada, and he imposed all sorts of ridiculous and impossible conditions for his entry. His father used every means he could to get Oskar into Canada, and finally in June of 1940, Oskar came to Canada, and in 1946 became a naturalized Canadian citizen. The reason I told the story of this escape from Europe was because many people attributed his dark and sentimental writing, particularly in his middle late years, to this 2-year nerve-wracking and harrowing experience running from the Nazis. His immediate family survived the war, but many extended family perished in concentration camps. Oskar never conceded that that was the reason for his dramatic writing. He addresses this topic in a 1994 interview on CBC's Fresh Air.
I wrote several very happy works when I was young, like my Carnival Overture, which is played all the time. But it's not me. Well, I tell you, there's one thing which I always believed in music and still believe. I think that the music you write, you have to feel and has to communicate something to the audience.
Oskar settled in Toronto in the home of his parents. As the family home in Prague, the castle in Sviatla, the business, everything was gone, left behind in Czechoslovakia, his father conceded that Oskar should continue his music studies. And so he enrolled at the Royal Conservatory in Toronto and studied with Albert Guerrero to become a pianist. Part of the Bachelor of Music included the study of composition. Oskar was frustrated by the quality and slow speed at which he wrote, and so he set himself the task of writing one fugue per week. And after 40 or 50 fugues, he found that it was a little bit easier, and he realized that composition is part inspiration, but a great part technique. For his Bachelor of Music, he had to produce one original composition, and for this, he wrote his String Quartet No. 1, which won a Capac Award. This gave him the confidence to continue composing, and his Opus No. 2 was a piano composition, which also won a Capac Award. For his Opus No. 3, he wrote Carnival Overture, a vigorous and joyful orchestral work influenced by the color and rhythms of the music from his Czech homeland. Well, naturally, composers want not just to write music, but also to be performed, but it was almost impossible to get symphonies to play Canadian works. Sir Ernest Macmillan was a prominent figure in the Toronto musical scene. He was the head of the TSO, Toronto Symphony. He was the dean of the Faculty of Music at the University of Toronto. And so one day, Oskar went timidly to his office, and he presented his orchestral work and asked Sir Ernest if he would consider programming it at one of his concerts. 2 weeks later, Sir Ernest said, "I'd like to program the work, but it has no title. What do you call it?" Well, it hadn't occurred to Oskar that it would be performed, and so he hadn't thought of a title. So Sir Ernest said, "Well, it has rhythmic vitality, colorful orchestration. Why don't we call it Carnival Overture?" Oskar didn't particularly like the title, but it was a huge success and is still played often today, and so the title stayed. Incidentally, Sir Ernest's father, Reverend Alexander Macmillan, married my parents in 1958. It was a great social event reported in the papers with many notable musicians in attendance. Now Oskar realized he could make it as a composer. And although composing was his main vocation, he still performed periodically as a pianist. Here's a short clip of him playing his scherzo. His father advised him to continue studies and get his doctorate in music, and for this, Oskar wrote his Symphony No. 1. He joined the Faculty of Music at the University of Toronto in 1952 and became a full-time professor and a composer of music. In recognition of all those fugues that Oskar labored over that led to him writing the String Quartet, Opus No. 1, we're going to hear one of his string quartets this evening. He wrote 6 in all, and although the first quartet won an award, he was not happy with it and removed it from circulation. We're going to hear his 5th quartet, which is an Ontario Arts Council commission to commemorate the 200th anniversary of Mozart's death in 1991. It's written as a symphonic poem based on 3 themes from Mozart's Requiem. It opens with the sorrowful sighs, the Lacrimosa, the Day of Tears, rising in tension to the Dies Irae, the Day of Wrath, to which Oskar added a restless contrapuntal line to dramatize the texture. And after a growing crescendo in the development, slow, heavy notes introduce the Kyrie, punctuated by trills. And as Mozart died before finishing the Requiem, the piece concludes in a serene, celestial atmosphere of peace. I'd like to now welcome Jasper, David, Eric, and Andrew to play the String Quartet No. 5. On the one hand, Oskar was the picture-perfect, absent-minded professor. For example, he often put his coffee cup down, forgot about it, and then went to make another one. Our home was accented by half-finished cups of coffee. But although he was forgetful of the trivial, his vast knowledge of the standard music repertoire could transform a dull harmony lesson into riveting explanations, illustrated by examples from the great masters. I'd like to play a first-hand example. This is an excerpt from a 1988 interview on CJRT radio, illustrating how Oskar pulled examples from music literature to demonstrate a point.
If you ask somebody what has the New World Symphony in common with Dvorak's cello concerto, you would say, well, they're completely different works. They are. But you know, the last movement of the New World Symphony, this very bright horn melody. Ba, bum, ba, bum, ba, 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 bum. Now remember the last bar. Da, da, ba, ba, ba. And now take the Dvorak concerto. Da, 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 ra, ba, ba. Or even in the New World Symphony, there's a gorgeous melody in the slow movement in C sharp minor, the second theme. Ti-ra-da-da-da, ti-ra-ra-ra-ra-ra-da, ti-ya-da-da-da-da-da-dee.
When he was not teaching, he was composing in full force. He could compose at his desk because he could hear the textures and orchestrations in his head, but he used the piano to try out dynamics or accents or to feel the middle note in a chord. After his first 3 successes, he entered a period of songwriting over the next 5 years. His love of voice dates back to his childhood love of opera. On his 13th birthday, he received the score of Tannhäuser, and henceforth he studied scores voraciously, learning the different clefs, transposing instruments, often hiding the music under his desk at school during class. Within a year, he had read through all Wagner operas and knew all the major sections by heart. He traveled to Bayreuth and saw Toscanini conduct Tannhäuser and Parsifal. He was accompanied by his mother on these trips, and on another trip to see The Ring, Oskar spent the whole trip from Prague to Bayreuth coaching his mother in all the motifs. In all, he wrote over 30 vocal works, and these have been interpreted by prominent vocalists. A large proportion of his vocal works are songs, a few a cappella choral works, but he never wrote an opera. He said, "I won't spend 2 years of my life working on something that will get performed once and never again." In that time, I could write 3 or 4 compositions that would get repeat performances. Well, with one exception, he wrote a 10-minute staged concert piece called Father William, based on a poem from Alice in Wonderland. And this last photograph was taken after performance of this operetta. To represent his vocal writing, we are going to hear 3 songs set to poems by William Blake. These are unusual for Oskar in that they're not dark, but rather cheerful, an appropriate selection for a 100th birthday celebration. And now I'd like to welcome Patrick and Mark to sing 3 songs by poems by William Blake. This is a chamber concert, so we don't have an orchestra hidden backstage. But it would be remiss of me not to mention the many successes of Oskar's orchestral works. Critics often praised Oskar as master of orchestration, no doubt a result of all that score reading he did when he was young, and continually absorbing new music as an adult. 2 seminal works of Oskar's career were written one after another. In 1967, Oskar met the Russian cellist Rostropovich, who liked Oskar's 2 fantasies for cello, and he said, "Write something for me, Oskar, but not a concerto, and not something with the usual form or content, and not with a standard size orchestra." Well, Oskar was perplexed as to how to meet these requirements. He tried a few sketches, but discarded them all. In 1968, he watched the Atlanta funeral procession on TV of the American civil rights leader, Martin Luther King. And when the TV showed King's gravestone with the inscription of his favorite spiritual, "Free at Last," Oskar knew exactly how he would fulfill Rostropovich's request. His work would depict the last day of King's life, the fatal shot, and the funeral. The funeral march would be based on King's favorite spiritual, and the orchestration would have no strings. The winds and percussion would portray a dignified march with a sorrowful cello line soaring above. This resulted in Memorial to Martin Luther King, which has been performed over 70 times with many cellists, including Yo-Yo Ma and Shauna Ralston, whose 1991 recording was nominated for a Juno. 2 years later, he wrote another orchestral work inspired by human tragedy. Oskar could not bring himself to read Anne Frank's diary, afraid it would stir up horrible memories from the war and pain from loss of his relatives. But when he finally did read it in 1967, he was struck by the beauty of it and wanted to set it to music. The passage he chose was one in which Anne prays for the safety of her school friend, Lise. In a twist of fate, Anne, who felt assured of her safety in the annex, hiding, perished in Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, where Lise survived. The work was almost complete when the CBC asked Oskar if he had permission from the publisher to use the words. Well, it hadn't occurred to Oskar that he'd need permission, and now he was very anxious. He had put his heart and soul into this work, and he was afraid of rejection. So he wrote an impassioned letter to the publisher about what the diary meant to him. And when he got no response, he called them, and they said, "Well, we can't give you the permission," at which point Oskar practically fell from his chair. And they continued, "We can't give you permission because the father of Anne Frank is still alive. And so we've taken the liberty of forwarding your letter on to Mr. Frank." Mr. Frank was the only surviving member of the annex, and he lived in Basel, Switzerland. He gave permission to Oskar to use the words, and thus began a correspondence in which they exchanged over 40 letters written in English and German. In 1973, Oskar visited Mr. Frank in Switzerland, and he asked him some questions, which he recorded on a tape recorder. This full interview is actually on the Oskar Morawetz website. One of the questions that Oskar asked was, what happened to the people that had hid the fugitives in the annex? The two secretaries from the office still lived in Holland. But Victor Kugler, Otto Frank's business associate, who arranged the whole hiding, lived in none other than Oskar's hometown of Toronto. He was a quiet, unassuming man who did not bring attention to his past. Here was a hero of a book that sold over 30 million copies, and he lived incognito in Canada's largest city. Oskar invited him to the premiere, and Mr. Kugler presented flowers to the soloist, Lois Marshall, on behalf of Mr. Frank. From the Diary of Anne Frank was composed in 1970 and has been performed over 40 times in Canada, the US, the Czech Republic, and in Israel, and including several times by Vancouver's very own maestro Bramwell Tovey. In 1974, Oskar presented the score to the Israeli Prime Minister on her visit to Toronto. The 2001 recording with Judith Forrest won a Juno Award for Best Classical Composition. Many other orchestral works were recognized with similar distinctions. Zubin Mehta awarded his piano concerto first prize in a nationwide competition by the Montreal Symphony. I call this my concerto because he finished writing it at 2 a.m. on the deadline date, dashed to the airport with score in hand to submit to Montreal, and then rushed home to get my mother to hospital in time for my birth. The Sinfonietta for Winds and Percussion won the Critics' Award in International Competition for Contemporary Music in Italy. This was another premiere with Zubin Mehta in February 1966. And I call this my brother's piece because the premiere took place 2 weeks after my brother Richard was born. His harp concerto was premiered by Erica Goodman in 1976 at the Guelph Spring Festival, and the 1989 recording with Janetta Baril won Oskar his first Juno Award for Best Classical Composition. And then there were awards bestowed upon Oskar himself for his contribution to music. Oskar received the Order of Ontario in the first year of investitures of this honor by the Lieutenant Governor Lincoln Alexander, and 2 years later he received the Order of Canada. In the latter part of his composing career, Oskar decided that he wanted to write a sonata for every instrument of the orchestra, a little like Hindemith. He began with a flute sonata, which was premiered in 1980, which was followed by a horn sonata, premiered the same year, which followed with an oboe sonata, clarinet, bassoon, tuba, trumpet, harp and viola, and 3 more violin sonatas. In all, he wrote a sonata for every instrument of the orchestra except for trombone and double bass. To represent Oskar's sonata period, we will now hear a work with not 1, but 2 winds. The 4 Duets for Flute and Bassoon is a 1982 Ontario Arts Council commission by flautist Jean Baxtresser and bassoonist David Carroll. But before they could premiere the work, this husband and wife team were both engaged as principals with the New York Philharmonic and moved to the United States. It was 3 years before the duets were performed in Toronto. The first duet is an ABAB form, alternating between andante and adagio. The second duet's a fast-paced allegro, and the third one's a melancholic two-part invention. And the last duet is a fast-paced allegro giocoso, exploiting the 5-octave range between the lowest note of the bassoon and a top note of the flute. The quick changes in register give the impression of 2 flutes playing. And now I'd like to welcome Brenda and Ingrid to play 4 duets for flute and bassoon. During his sonata period, Oskar experienced 2 major life events. In 1982, he was divorced and he retired. My brother and I had moved out, gone on to university, and he had the house to himself, composing full-time. This was the heyday of his sunset years. He was composing, traveling for performances of his works, visiting family and friends. He was enjoying this newfound bachelorhood for just over 10 years until 1995. And in the last years of his life, he suffered from depression and eventually passed away from complications from Parkinson's disease, exactly 10 years ago at the age of 90. In a 1992 interview, Oskar was asked what he thinks will be his legacy after he dies. I'd like to show one last video demonstrating his practical answer to this question.
You know, people often ask me a question which I find rather embarrassing when they say, do you think that your music will be played after your death? And I always say it really doesn't make any difference what people write about you or say about you. There's only one thing which will decide, or 2 things, which if your music will be played after you die. One is if artists, soloists or conductors want to perform it, and the other is if people want to hear those pieces. If both happen, well, that's fine, then your music will be played afterwards. But if none of them happens, it doesn't matter what historians will say and so on, and there's no chance.
I think my father would be pleased that musicians want to play and that you are all here today to hear his music. In fact, 8 different Canadian orchestras are paying tribute to him this spring by performing his orchestral works. We are here today to celebrate his life as a composer and as a person. And what better way to celebrate a 100th birthday than with a birthday cake? This is Oskar's mother on her 100th birthday, surrounded by her great-grandchildren and our family's traditional Czech cake. I invite you to join us in the lobby afterwards to sample a similar dessert. But before that, I'd like to ask the musicians who have graciously participated in this concert to return to the stage so we can acknowledge their playing.